When looking at what weapon classes are considered the worst in Splatoon 3, while the Brellas may have held that title at the start with some new god kits from the Sorella brand, I think that rollers and brushes have become strong candidates for the worst class in this game. Rollers especially have some big reputations for some flawed weapons we'll get to soon enough. Despite this though, I think that this class is very fun casually with a unique style, and some of them aren't far off from being good weapons. And brushes have a fairly unique playstyle with their mobility that aren't far off of being good, so let's see if we can fix them both. Subscribe to see more weapon rebalancing in the future, and let's get started. First off, any class-wide changes. One thing I think could use a slight power boost is the vertical flick on all rollers. Since this is a harder and slower flick, I feel like it should be very impactful, and up close it definitely is. But at a distance, it's kinda underwhelming. While I think making it a 2-shot would be extreme in most cases, being able to finish off kills on weakened opponents I think is something would benefit these weapons given the slow speed. So to help it out a little bit, let's increase the minimum damage from 40 to 45. I think this will help a lot more than it might look. The first two weapons on our list, the carbon and regular roller, will actually be some of the first in the series to have no changes. Well, outside of the global clash change. This already is a huge buff to them given that carbon has burst bomb combos with its vertical flick, as well as regular roller's verticals being incredibly strong at ledge peeking as it is. Both these weapons see very prominent tournament results, including both of these weapons being in the grand finals of the most recent Area Cup, and have pretty much perfect kits, with Burst Bomb and Zuka being a tried and true combo returning from Splatoon 1, and the base roller kit having access to great mobility options with a recently buffed curling bomb and big bubbler. On top of that, the recent buffs that both of these rollers got with their horizontal flick radius being wider gives that flick its own unique identity as a reliable kill option. Both of these weapons are looking up right now with dominant niches, prominent tournament results, and good kits. There isn't really much more you could ask for. Dynamo Roller is up next, and this is a long topic. So long, in fact, I've covered Dynamo's history in its own video, so to avoid repeating myself too much, I'm just gonna say you should check it out. I'll go through my changes really quickly. The vertical flick has no sense of identity and is basically just a giant downside, so we're gonna be making it a 70 damage minimum, giving it a solid 2-shot and usefulness as a poking tool against longer range weapons that deal with it. In addition to this, we can remove some of the randomness on the horizontal flick paint, making it a bit more consistent toward its output, and slightly increase the damage range on horizontal flicks to match 52 gal. Now that Dynamo has two good kits, this should be more than enough to help its use in top level play. Next up is the Flingza Roller, the one that's found the most success in early Splatoon 3, being amazing at spamming missiles while sitting back the whole game. And ever since missiles got the cooldown nerf, the usage rate tanked off a cliff. Well, luckily because of that tone down, we don't have to tone back the vertical flick paint, but this weapon's balancing history has kinda left the horizontal flick a little bit weak. Flingza Roller should be a flexible roller, something that can go between painting and supporting, but also fighting with its two very different flicks. So I want to buff the horizontal flick to allow it to play better to that playstyle. The range on this thing is just kind of tiny, so let's give it about 5% more range so it can reach a little bit further. I think that's actually enough. It has a solid kit, and now that the vertical flick is going to do more damage, I think that's going to be really strong on its own. So a horizontal flick that can actually fight and has a bit more movement capabilities, I think will be a lot for this weapon. Finally, let's talk about the Big Swig. This weapon has struggled a lot given the fighting meta Cooler provides, and on top of that has two weak hits due to having just awful sub-weapons to get it in. However, Big Swig isn't that bad. It has some pretty interesting strengths. The vertical flick is really fast with a lot of range, which means it's a great movement and poke tool. It basically is like having a mini cheaper curling bomb with it. It's awesome. And with the 45 damage minimum that we did earlier, I think it'll be in a good spot. However, when it comes to one-shotting, something very important since this is the only flick that does it, its hitbox for some reason is slightly smaller than other vertical flicks on other rollers. No idea why this is there, but it should definitely be adjusted. That way it's a bit easier to hit. The horizontal flick, on the other hand, has such a large hitbox that it's actually a great close-range AoE tool for finishing off weakened opponents. It's like the biggest hitbox in the game, and it does a consistent 35 minimum. I think we can expand on this strength though to make it a bit better of a combo number by buffing it from 35 to 40 damage. This will help with a lot of different numbers, such as things like 96 gal, blasters, or tri-slosher being able to combo with it more effectively. However, let's be honest, the main thing this thing needs is some better kits, especially a sub-weapon that can help it fight or get in. I think a third kit is in order. I'm gonna go with Auto Bomb for the sub-weapon. It's a nice scouting tool that's cheap to use, it keeps the painting intact, and gives it some location to work with. It's just going to be very easy for the weapon to use and adds to its utility as a support. However, However, since that's a bit less combat helpful than the other bombs, let's give it an amazingly flexible special weapon with the Booyah Bomb. This will give it a potential survivability tool, and due to its insane output, it'll have this a lot, giving it quite a bit of options if it positions near its teammates. And on top of that, it can function as an entry tool and a way to help paint zones. These changes in general make it much more useful in fighting as a support, increase its power with its niche in zones, and give it better ways to work around its weaknesses with its overall much better damage. For the class-wide changes for Inkbrush, it's just going to be a simple one. Inkbrush has permanent ink resistance whenever it's rolling, so it doesn't take damage when it turns sharply, mainly to the left. Octobrush and Paintbrush don't have this for some reason, so this will be made a universal class thing. Onto Inkbrush itself, it's honestly in a pretty decent spot right now. Cooler makes everything faster, so it struggles to carve its own niche as well, but of course its mobility is still fairly unique, and on top of that, with the recent Killer Whale buff, its base kit is pretty good. I think it could use a slight nudge though, so I think a good change to make would be slightly improving its fall-off damage. Inkbrush's damage at maximum range can be really pathetic, and while it should be bad, I mean, come on, sometimes its damage is literally a 6-shot. So my idea is to make Inkbrush's absolute minimum damage 22. This means it'll at minimum be a 5-shot, and if opponents are slightly weak, it should be a 4-shot pretty reliably, which I think would help it out a lot. Octobrush, while having some decent kits, suffers from a similar problem of very inconsistent damage that could use some positive tweaking. First off, the maximum damage range will be increased to about a whole line, which is still pretty damn short, but I mean, if the brush is hitting them, it should probably be dealing maximum damage. And secondly, we'll be adjusting the same minimum damage problem. This weapon will deal a minimum of 26 damage from now on, making it a guaranteed 4-shot. These changes will just help make it a little bit more reliable, as this weapon is an important check to short-range weapons, since it can get away with taking advantage of map terrain and can deal with shooter mobility pretty well, so it should be getting reliable picks if weapons are taking fights in its range. Finally is the Paintbrush, a weapon that's gotten a lot better since some recent fixes, but is still a little bit too weak. Like with the other brushes, it'll be getting the same minimum damage change. In this case, the absolute minimum that a flick is allowed to do on Paintbrush is going to be 30 damage, making it a guaranteed and pretty solid 4-shot, the 30 damage number being important to combo with a few other weapons. However, the main problem with this weapon is that if you want to do anything, and I mean anything, this giant windup at the start is a big problem. This is currently 23 frames, which is a ridiculous amount of time. And while this windup is an important weakness, I think right now it makes it a little bit too slow. So we'll decrease it by 3 frames to a 20 frame windup. Still enough to be massively slow, but it'll give you a little bit more leeway to get your shots out. And that's all the changes. These weapons aren't too far off from being in a good spot, and some of them are already there. So I think a few tweaks in the right direction are all these classes need to be in a good spot. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you all next time.